4 months ago, I posted a video about playing Daggerheart solo on my channel, and today it has over 10,000 views. This time, instead of playing the quick start adventure, I spent the last 6 weeks playing in a complete sandbox and developed the whole story through play. And while it worked great most of the time, there were a few things that I felt needed tweaking. So if you're interested in playing Daggerheart by yourself, this is the video for you. In this video, I will walk you through my own solo guide called Daggersworn. I will talk about my experiences while playing solo, some problems I faced, and some house rules I used to improve my solo play experience. Welcome to I Roll Alone, my name is Daniel, and before we begin, there is something I need to say about this video in particular. There are many ways to play an RPG by yourself, and while I did write my own solo guide, it is by no means the only way to play. Still, it is the one I will be focusing on today, and I do think it turned out quite well. So, without further ado, let's look at Daggersworn. So, this is Daggersworn. And first thing we have to do is look at the title page, because a quick shout out to Andy Gray is due. He was kind enough to provide me with this illustration of the two characters I played, Rachel and Clank. As you can see from the table of contents, I talk a bit about what you can expect from this guide and some essential tools for solo play. For the sake of not making this video too long, I won't be going over that in detail, but focus on a few essential topics that I feel make this guide stand out. The second thing I want to show you is actually at the end of this book. If you are familiar with solo play, you will probably be familiar with random tables that are used to give inspiration to what is happening in the story. In a very early version of this guide, I used the action and theme tables that you can find in Ironsworn. However, I suck at word associations, and I started looking at different things like tarot cards. The problem is that not everyone has access to it. What I found was that besides tarot, there is a different divination technique developed by Marie-Anne Lenormand, which in its smallest version uses 36 cards. I took those cards, or the words on them, and put them into a D66 table. So over here you find the cards and these general symbols, and below here and on the next page you will find some explanation of what they mean. You can use this whenever you need an answer to a question that isn't a yes or no question, to get a feeling or a vibe of what it means. I provided some common ways to use it, but please keep in mind that I'm absolutely no expert when it comes to using divination techniques. Some other things you find here is a NPC generator with some names you can use, some hooks for the NPC, as well as an ancestry generator, and some GM moves or ideas for GM moves and complications you can use if you don't have any idea how to interpret a role. Now, let's go back to the beginning and talk about a specific mechanic that I use throughout my play, the fear check. And one of the great things about Daggerheart is the duality dice and the meta resources that it provides. We can also use this as a way to guide our decision-making in solo play. In a way, the amount of fear tokens we have represent a lack of control over the story. To represent this in play, I came up with the fear check. You simply roll a d12 and compare it to the amount of fear tokens you have. If you roll under or equal to that number, it should come with a consequence. So if you have 5 fear tokens and you roll a 5 or lower, it means the check was successful. If you roll an 8, like I just did, it was unsuccessful. There are really 2 ways to use this. The first one is when you set up a scene. Here we are in chapter 4, where I talk about different ways to tell a story and how I structured my scenes using nested clocks. The way many GM emulators approach a scene is by starting with your expectation about how it should play out or present itself. Then you find out if your expectation is true or if it is altered in any way. This way you add surprise to your story. In Daggersworn, you can use the fear check. If the fear check is successful, you roll on table 1 and add something to the scene, something major and relevant. And if the fear check was unsuccessful, you roll on table 2 and add something useful, some immersion, or you leave it as it is. I explain what each element means in more detail in the booklet, and I also added some more random tables for your convenience. But let's look at an example. I currently have 3 fear tokens. My characters arrive at Netherwall with their captive as the sun is setting. There are 2 guards at the gate, and a few other travelers are entering the city gates. That is my expectation. Now I roll and see what happens. If I roll a 5, the fear check was unsuccessful, and I then roll a d6 on table 2. The scene could be as expected. I could add a smell or a sound. Maybe I advance my threat, and the person I'm trying to fight inside the city was already expecting me and is sending me an escort. If I rolled a 3 or lower, I roll on table 1, and I apply the result. Maybe the members of the cult that have been getting in my way in the previous scenes are standing at the gate. That would be history. Maybe the guard is someone I recognize, and I now need to find another way in. This could be a challenge or also history or something inconvenient. It really depends on the context of your previous scenes and the context of your story. I also added some options that are specific to Daggerheart, like campaign frame features. And I also added the answer a question section because most campaign frames offer some specific questions that you usually answer during a session 0. But I thought it might be a cool idea to include this and give you an option to roll it up randomly. In case you are wondering what a nested clock is, it is a way for me to make sure my story has an end and follows a little bit of a structure. How to tell a story in solo play is something that can be discussed at length, and there are many ways to do it depending on what system you use. If you're interested in my approach to this, or this product in general, Daggersworn is available for pay what you want, so you can get it for the price of nothing. And I really encourage you to just read through it and check it out. If you want to support my work, you can pay for it, but please only do that if you can actually afford it. And I also ask you to not pay more than the $1 that is the suggested price. Now, back to the fear check. The second way you can use it is to determine when to use a GM move. But before we talk about that, we need to understand what a GM move is. Reading through the Daggerheart subreddit, I got the impression that a lot of people think it means spending fear, which is not true, at least not completely. A GM move is basically anything the GM does. It is a narrative response to your player actions. Just setting the scene can be considered a GM move. They can be further categorized in soft moves and hard moves. And while that sounds like a clear distinction, it is, unfortunately, not that simple. In short, a soft move is something a player can react to. It is new information, it is an opportunity, it is the foreshadowing of coming danger. And if ignored, it can become a hard move. A hard move should have immediate consequences, like an enemy appearing, taking physical or mental damage, or the loss of something important. Fear, on the other hand, is used to escalate the situation. It is used to emphasize the conflict. It is used to highlight a scene and give it more importance. You can use it to take the spotlight from the players and make additional moves. And the core rules have a clear list of things you can do with it. So how do we decide when to use fear? And that is when the fear check comes in. If you ever wonder whether you should spend your fear tokens, make a check. The more fear you have, the more likely you are to spend it. You usually make a GM move after either a failed action roll or a success with fear. That is when I usually make a fear check to decide whether or not I should escalate the situation. And sometimes I actually just wonder, like, have things been too easy? Should I spend fear? and that's when I make a check. Speaking of action rolls, let's look at some examples and how to incorporate the hope and fear mechanic into the GM moves. So after setting the scene and playing through it, you will at some point make an action roll. And when you roll a success with fear or failure, you will need to make a GM move. And here I provided a D6 table you can roll on. Keep in mind though that it is rather boring to always make an enemy appear, which is why I recommend choosing or re-rolling if you keep coming up with the same result or if it just doesn't make sense. I go over each of these results in more detail in the document, trying to provide some examples of what I actually trying to say here. But going over each of these in this video is probably a little bit excessive, especially numbers 2 and 3 I think are pretty obvious. What I really want to highlight is this: start or advance a thread clock. I typically create a clock with 4 or 6 segments on it, and I just advance it. And whenever it's full, something happens. It is also a good way to spend additional fear and introduce a complication in a later scene that maybe would have been rather boring otherwise. It also offsets a little bit of decision making to a future scene when right now you don't really know what you want to happen. I also provided a D6 table for new opportunities that you can roll on whenever you roll with hope, either when you roll a failure with hope or even when you roll a critical success. I probably wouldn't roll on it on just a regular success. I think that it's a little bit boring. So now let's look at some examples from my play. So my character's goal was to travel to the grave of the gods and renew a blessing on a runestone. So I decided to zoom in a little bit on that travel sequence, and I used my ranger's Wayfarer ability to travel to the highland peaks where the grave is located. I imagined my characters in front of the city gate, ready to leave, the weather still a bit damp after the last night's storm. I checked my expectations using the fear check, and after I failed the fear check, I rolled a d6 and everything was as expected. I determined randomly through an oracle question, which I provide also in the beginning of the book, for simple yes and no questions. And I determined randomly if my ranger had been to the Highland Peaks before. As they are Wonderborn, I thought it was likely, and the oracle said yes. Next, I made an instinct roll with advantage and rolled a success with fear. As we were traveling, I thought it made sense that an enemy appeared. I used a landmark generator, which you can find here. And this is from, this happened in an earlier iteration of this book, but I used the landmark generator to decide I was at an abandoned tower, and I just decided that it made sense that I would encounter some zombies there. After I won, I had a look around. I asked the oracle if there were more zombies around because I thought that might be an interesting approach to the story, but it said no. So my characters had a long night's rest or a long rest, and on the next day I set a new scene. And when I checked my expectations, I added something. Some soldiers from the Realm Guard were out on patrol, which my characters didn't want to encounter. So I had to do a finesse roll with fear again, and I marked a stress as a result. But it was successful, so they didn't see me. I continued my travel with another instinct roll. This time it was a critical success, and on that critical success, because I thought it might be interesting, I had a helpful NPC appear. I used the NPC generator in the back, and I generated a Galapa which had visions. And the story was that this person was waiting for me because it had these visions of my characters appearing. Obviously, my player characters were very skeptical about this, and they attempted an instinct roll, which ended in a failure with fear. And as a result, this isn't on here anymore. This was another one, but there was a cost. And what I decided was that they lost faith in me, or in the case of the earlier iteration, it was that the scene changed in a dramatic way. And I decided that this NPC became offended and was actually not just a random person, but a prophet for the gods. And he was now offended and saw my characters as unworthy. My attempt to smooth things over ended in a success with fear, which appeased him. But as a cost, he decided to test us. And he used some magic to suck us through quicksand into a dungeon. And our new mission was to clear the dungeon and prove our worth to the prophet and the gods. This is obviously a very, very abridged version of what happened, but I hope it shows what is possible with this system. I do have 3 actual plays available on my Substack. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time right now to continue writing them. And keep in mind that this system I am presenting you now, as I said, evolved over time, and I made quite a few changes and experimented with quite a few things. I will say this though, if this video does well and people are interested, I will gladly do an actual play session either as a live stream or on video. So maybe you saw it earlier, but in my examples I gave quite a bit of an example of quite a bit of travel, and I did write a whole chapter on traversal and exploration. And in this method, I borrowed heavily from Ironsworn. And I actually gave some examples of how to use it with the Ironsworn Delve mechanic and basically adapted our system to the Ironsworn Delve method. What I really want to talk more about in detail is combat. Because combat is a large part of Daggerheart, as it is for most traditional TTRPGs. And what's really great about this system in particular is that it is really easy to balance for the number of player characters. While games like D&D typically recommend either using a sidekick or enhancing your character's stats, that felt largely unnecessary for me here. I did encounter 2 major issues though that I had to solve. The first one is the number of enemies. I play mostly Theater of Mind, but even when using minis, anything more than 3 to 4 enemies became rather tedious. Luckily, the game provides its own solution. You can spend 2 battle points by increasing the damage output by a d4. I simply chose the option of a flat damage increase of +2 and then created some sample tables for a standard, easy, and dangerous difficulty. Feel free to roll on them or just choose. The second problem, and one that really annoyed me, was the time it took to run an encounter. Obviously, running fewer monsters helped, but using 2 specific house rules really made a difference. First, we will be using a no roll to hit rule inspired by Nimble 5e. It essentially means we just roll straight damage and apply that to the enemies. So if I roll a d8, my enemy takes 3 damage plus modifiers. We only miss if we roll a 1. If we roll multiple dice, it's the one furthest on the left that determines if we miss. So this would be considered a miss. If I rolled a 5 and a 1, so a 1 on any other dice, this would still be considered a hit and do 6 damage plus modifiers. Additionally, I rolled my duality dice to determine hope and fear and the chance of a critical hit. So right now, this would be 6 damage, and I rolled with fear. That method might break some of the game's features, and I try to provide a solution where I can. But in the end, it's a house rule, and it will have its downsides. For me personally, it worked great. It also doesn't really work the other way around, as it makes evasion, unfortunately, completely useless. The second method I suggest is introducing a morale check, where you roll under a target number. If you fail, the enemy flees. so a minion would have to roll 8 or lower or would leave the fight. And this ensures that a leader or a solo has a lower chance of fleeing than, for example, a standard enemy or a support. That being said, if you enjoy the combat as is, don't change anything. I think I covered most aspects of playing Daggerheart solo, but there's one more thing that I need to mention. And that is something that really bothered me when playing. I hate setting a target difficulty. I find it super annoying. It breaks immersion because I start to think about how difficult something should be, if I should make it easier, if I should make it harder, if I'm being fair to myself. I tried a bunch of methods and ultimately there isn't a great solution, but only trade-offs. I go into theory in a bit more detail in this segment, but ultimately I want to present two options. First, we can use a roll under mechanic. For this we use 12 as our starting point and we add our modifiers. If my agility is +3, I now need to roll a 15 or lower to succeed. Critical hits remain unchanged. I picked 12 because with a modifier of 0, and considering critical hits, the chance of success is roughly 50%. For the second method, we roll our 2d12 against a d20 and we add our modifiers. Our goal is to beat the sum of both our duality dice. So right now I would have to beat an 8 with an 8 plus a modifier. So for example, +3 for agility. As this is relatively tough, we need to add a +1 modifier to all of our abilities. That being said, both options will have the effect that your tier 1 characters are capable but not overpowered and become more capable and more powerful at higher levels. I recommend not using either of these methods for combat. It sucks. I think that covers Daggersworn, but there's one question that I haven't answered yet. How was it? How was my overall experience in playing this game? Overall, it was really cool. I really enjoyed it. And I'm not just saying that because I wrote my own guide. I find it offers some crunch without being overwhelming. Compared to D&D, I don't have to think about how many modifiers to apply, how many dice to roll. Everything was really clear with some very interesting character abilities. Combat has a cool action economy that is driven by your rolls. I really enjoyed the armor system, especially for solo play. There are no damage spikes to take you out in one hit, which can be a problem when playing solo. On the other hand, when I made my first video, I thought that the fear mechanic was super useful. And while I still think it is a cool approach, I do have a bit more experience now and I find that a lot of the cool elements of solo play come from random elements. A random event, new NPCs, or new factions appearing. It's the partial successes, the partial failures that drive the narrative. And I ended up using fear mostly in combat to put pressure on my characters. And for that, it was still really useful. But I used it more as a combat resource than a narrative resource. All that's left to say is, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please check out Daggersworn and let me know how you like it. See you next time.